America had the opportunity. That was a true inflection point where history was not predetermined. We could have gone anywhere from there. You go from having more power, relative power, than any civilization in history, winning a century of nuclear war, only to blow it and then maybe lose 20 years later. That was the worst policy mistake of all time. So I think that was really the mistake where we might have lost it forever.
Nick Fuentes just shared his thoughts on what he thinks was the last good year in American history. And if you guys pay attention to the channel, you know there's a lot of bad and dark inflection points in American history, bad junctures, and some good ones too. But let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Nick, what was the last good year in America?
The last good year, probably... Oh, that's a difficult question. I would say maybe times were pretty good when I was growing up. A lot of people might set it way back in the past or decades in the past. I still believe that America was a great country up until very recently. I would argue maybe 2007 or 2008, maybe before Obama got elected and the recession. I think that was probably the last great year.
That's when the iPhone became popular too, and everyone was getting iPods. But how about from like a policy point of view?
From a policy point of view, maybe 2000. And here's why. You have to look at the 20th century in this way. You have these major wars in Europe, which is really one war. You have the rise of Germany, which is what creates World War I, World War II. And the United States rises to the occasion and becomes a superpower. But then we're locked in this contest with the Soviet Union. And basically the United States doesn't know the end of war for 70 years. Because we get involved in World War I. Right away, we're in World War II. Then we're fighting on every continent in the Cold War. And what happens in 91 on Christmas is the Soviet Union collapses. And with it, literally the only other world power, the only other great power in the world. Europe is hollowed out. China has not yet begun its rise. Japan arguably had a competitive economy, but no military or anything. And so in 1991, you have what they now call the unipolar moment, which is that the United States enjoys more relative power, a bigger advantage over every other country put together than maybe any country has in history. No other country has had that kind of preeminence.
Totally agree with him. Actually, I was very confused at his first answer when he said 2007, because in my eyes, 2001 and 2007, that time frame is some of the worst times in U.S. history. You got the War on Terror, you got occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, the DHS, the Patriot Act, NSA surveillance spiraling out of control. But now I'm right here with him. I mean, this is such a mature answer. If he's leading up to what I think is what he's going to say is that the United States squandered the unipolar moment by getting engaged in all sorts of entangling alliances, trying to impress our will militarily through global hegemony and empire building schemes, and to stretch U.S. influence throughout the rest of the world by bullying the rest of the world at a time where we could have solidified ourselves internally, focused inward, rather than these empire building schemes that have caused catastrophe for all countries prior to ours doing that.
And we made some mistakes in the 1990s. Maybe we were a little too aggressive in Yugoslavia, and there were some other mistakes. We didn't catch the World Trade Center bombing and some other things. But times were pretty good in the 1990s. I think people remember that as a time when we had the luxury of not caring about politics, actually. But what happens after 9/11 is that we begin to squander that advantage. Rather than take the peace dividend, which is we don't have to fight the Soviet Union, we don't have to build a giant nuclear arsenal, we don't have to have a giant military anymore. Rather than take this peace dividend and invest it into America, reinvest in our people, in our infrastructure, in our industry, we start to do the opposite. And so we go to war in Afghanistan. Then we go to war in Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of troops in the Middle East with a dozen strategic objectives. We're going to topple Saddam. Then we're going to build a democracy. Then we're going to do... At the same time, we bring China into the World Trade Organization, literally right around that same time. I think it was the year 2000. And we start to send all the factories over to China. A few years after NAFTA, we start to send all the factories to Mexico and Canada. And so this is the most heartbreaking thing in world history. We won. We won World War I, World War II, World War III with the Soviet Union. How many people died on the shores of Normandy? How many people died in the jungles of Vietnam? Fought so hard, sacrificed so much, stood up in the most paranoid time, Cuban Missile Crisis. We came out victorious. And rather than enjoy the spoils of the war and guarantee a 1,000-year American empire, we blew it.
Totally agree. This is such a good answer. I mean, I would differ in some respects in terms of the trade arrangements. I'm not for NAFTA for the same reasons that Ron Paul was against it. I'm not for centralized economic planning whatsoever in terms of trade deals. I think that trade should go on between peoples of the world unmolested by governments, regardless. And what you had was the specialization of labor and the United States becoming more of a service-based country, which is a good thing. We have benefited immeasurably from cheap goods from other countries, and then we benefit by selling our services to other countries. We have trade deficits with Amazon. I buy lots of products from Amazon. I haven't sold Amazon a single thing, but my life has increased exponentially because of that. But at the same time, Nick is exactly right here. The United States totally squandered this unprecedented moment, really, in world history, where there really was only one superpower in the world. Even at the height of the Roman Empire, you had the Han Dynasty vying against it. That wasn't even the case back then, that there was a single world dominant power like the United States was in 1991. So what he's saying is so many of these absurdities caused catastrophe and catalyzed the despotism that we see in terms of the debt, in terms of inflation. I'm taking it. But I think this is such a mature answer, and it's one that I might give. I think I would give 1912 because that was the year prior to the income tax, the IRS, the Federal Reserve, and the 17th Amendment, all of which I think are total catastrophes as well. But this is a really good answer if you ask me.
We gave it to China. We just gave it to them. We gave it to Mexico. We gave it to Israel. And what inevitably happens 15 years later is Russia starts to rebuild. China, the 1 billion man empire. And, by the way, it's an anomaly of history that China was so inferior compared to the West for the last 500 years. It was inevitable that China would come back in a big way. Now that we blew our advantage, now we find ourselves desperate, scrambling, trying to rebuild our country fast enough to prevent China from invading Taiwan. And it's a big question mark. There's a lot of uncertainty if we'll even be a country in 50 years. So go figure. You go from having more power, relative power, than any civilization in history, winning a century of nuclear war, only to blow it and then maybe lose 20 years later. That was the worst policy mistake of all time.
Yeah, I think it's among there. I think that is a really good point. I think it was inevitable that China and Russia would rebuild after the Cold War, though. Where could they go from where they were? You had Deng Xiaoping in China deciding to open up Chinese markets, and he didn't just do it radically, he did it gradually. But China improved and prospered because of an embrace in trade. The Russian Federation as well. That is what happened. Countries in Southeast Asia that were communist, like Vietnam, did the same thing. Malaysia's done that. Other countries that were more or less closed off in many different ways opened their markets and prospered accordingly because that's what trade does. It opens up consumer choices and competition, takes the economy away from a centrally planned economy where you have protectionism closing off trade. And what really protectionism is in the absolute, in an ad reductio absurdum argument, is that you're saying that you're doing to your own country in peacetime what your adversaries would do in war. You're closing off foreign trade. You think that's a good idea? Why don't you just take it down a level lower? Why don't everyone in just one U.S. state only trade with each other? Does that create prosperity? What about one city? What about one community? What about in your family? Does that create trade because it protects the goods and services and the prices and profits you can accumulate from them? No, because the specialization of labor and comparative advantage is important. David Ricardo, proved that in the 1810s, and we're supposed to pretend that wasn't proven? No, I'm sorry. So in that way, we disagree a little bit, but it is true that this was a squandered moment where the U.S. could have, in peacetime, prospered immensely, but threw that away for empire building schemes as a result of violating the basic tenets of the best wisdom of the founders, is stop these entangling alliances, like Jefferson and Washington said. That is true.
So you'd pinpoint it to 2001?
2001.
I'm a bit surprised at your answer. I thought you might be inclined to say like around the assassination of JFK, the formation of the CIA, like kind of the beginning of removing God from the US. Why do you kind of like prefer 2001 over that time period? Because I would guess that your key issue that you see is godlessness. Is that right?
I mean, to me, that's more of a global problem.
Okay.
Because it wasn't really, this is truly a symptom of modernity. I think because of technological innovation, because of abundance and prosperity, it goes hand in hand. Every time there is an increase in the quality of life, I think people apostatize, people lose the faith. Because it's easier to have faith when you're poor and miserable than when you're rich and happy, when your belly's full, because it's easier to distract yourself and there's less of an urgent need to explain suffering or meaninglessness.
Totally agree with him on that. That shows a lot of wisdom, too. I mean, we're so blessed beyond imagination despite all the woes our government causes, and the debt and inflation and the endless wars and the deep state and the welfare state and the corporate welfare, the banking lobby, big pharma lobby, you have it. There are lots of bad things in the United States, but we're blessed with distractions like, phones and sports. And I'm not saying you can't multitask, care about, virtue and government and tyranny while being blessed with accommodations that very few generations before us have had. But I think there's also truth to what he's saying there too.
So to me, I don't really diagnose that as a specifically American problem. And here's the other thing. America had an opportunity to be reborn, you could say, in that moment. America had the opportunity. That was a true inflection point where history was not, let's say, predetermined. We could have gone anywhere from there. After the 1990s, you really could have had a moment where the country became stronger and fortified itself. And maybe we could have fixed those problems even after 9/11. Look at the approval rating of George W. Bush after 9/11. It was 94%, higher than any president in history. Patriotism, togetherness was at an all-time high. You could even argue that after 9/11, we could have come together and be reborn as a country. But instead, we doubled down on all of our worst impulses, more surveillance, more war, more suspicion, more corruption, more lies about Iraq, more opportunism. So I think that was really the mistake where we might have lost it forever.
Man, I just totally agree with him in general here. We have some differences in regard to trade policy and the implications of that and what China and Russia would have done. I think that they would have rebuilt regardless of what the U.S. did. They would have engaged in trade regardless of what the U.S. did. But the harm did come in warfare, empire building, bases across the world, bellicose foreign policy, slapping sanctions on all regimes we don't like Cuba and Syria and Iran, bombing all the countries Israel doesn't like Iran and Iraq and Libya and Syria, and getting bogged down in the Middle East because of this, and never benefiting in any way, actually losing our own sovereignty in the process through the emergence of AIPAC and the Israel lobby that John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt have written extensively about. I know Nick promotes their book, The Israel Lobby, often as well. I think it's an incredible book. But this is such a mature answer. I think it's one of, 5 answers that I might give. I said 1912 earlier because during the Progressive era, that was a huge watershed moment to have the central bank come back for the first time in something like 70 years since the Second National Bank was dismantled by Jackson. So you have a new central bank, which is a scheme to fleece the American public and finance endless wars, endless welfare, etc., and not have to worry about it politically, because you don't even have to raise taxes anymore. I mean, you can raise taxes. They've shifted a little bit through time, but you can just use a oligarchy to impose an invisible tax called inflation without even legislating it, and no one seems to care anymore. It would have been, very contentious back when people understood what they were doing, but it's become galvanized and a precedent over several generations, and people just expect it to be like a law of nature that, like, yeah, the dollar just innately loses value. But that wasn't true in the age before central banking. Actually, there was deflation in the prospect that your currency, your dollar, now it's a fiat, it's really a Federal Reserve note and not a dollar because it's not backed with a tangible asset, but it actually used to appreciate in value, if you could believe it. But instead, everyone watching this knows that candy bars were, a fourth of the price that they were when they were growing up compared to what they are now. And that's because of this engine. But it's also the IRS. The United States did not used to tax individual income or earnings. All of the taxes in the United States for something like 150 years, for almost the most part, there was a temporary income tax during the Civil War. But other than that, we're taxed through tariffs and excises and various other duties such as that, and not income tax at all. You kept your entire paycheck. A lot of Americans don't know that either. But in the 17th Amendment, instead of having the states actually play a role in federal policy and elect the senators, now they're just beholden to Washington lobbies because the citizens elect them democratically at a local level. But it's been a bad thing because they don't care about the citizens that elected them. They go to Washington and just get won over by Lockheed Martin and JP Morgan and Pfizer. And those are their new constituents for 6 years. They come back every 6 years, get reelected. The reelection rates are through the roof. And they don't have to care about the concerns of their citizens. Whereas the state governments used to have actually a role in the federal government. As Fisher Ames, the founding father from Massachusetts, said, they used to be ambassadors of the states in the Senate. That was their purpose. So 1912 is a good year. You could say 1860. I mean, we became a centralized hegemonic nation, which was not the intention of the founders. The intention was there to be a league of states where most political power was decentralized. You still have that to a small extent, but more and more we become a national leviathan with an imposing presence of a national government, an oligarchy that can basically do whatever it wants, regulate the amount of water in our toilets. That's crazy. And there's other moments you could give, but I think Nick gave a good one in relating it to the unipolar moment, because it truly was a moment that was squandered. The war on terror completely betrayed the best American values that I think the founders espoused too. And I think he laid out a very good case there. So I think this was a good discussion. What do you guys think? What was the last good year in American history? Or you can put it in this way. What do you think was the most destructive year in U.S. history? I'm going to say 1912 to 1913 was the most last good to the most destructive. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Jack Neal. Great podcast, great segment, and really good question, man. This interview was filled with great questions from Jack, so I want to applaud him for that. Really interesting interview in general, so check it out. Also, if you like my take or this video, please consider joining the channel as a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button below. And if you do that, I'll give you all of my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. So you'll be able to see all those members only videos immediately without having to wait for them to go live. And I really appreciate your support if you do that. Also, if you want a free copy of my first book, Compact of the Republic, click the link in the description below. It'll shoot you off to a website. Just plug in your email and I'll send that right to you in PDF form, free of charge, no obligation, just because you're awesome. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.